This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Writer Life. My topic for today is going to be the weaving of tales, which is what all writers do. We take a patchwork of little stories and hopefully we sew them together to create a much greater, much more in-depth story. And there's one story in particular that I spent an awful lot of time weaving, and that's where my mind is going to be today. And I'm going to take a good long look at some of the smaller details of the story and why they're so important. Currently, I'm working on a new book. I suppose it's no real surprise. Because this, out of a few that I've actually got stashed away to be given the final edits, is in many ways a pretty special story. Since 2018, I've been really busy working silently on what most of you now know to be the story arc that features the characters of Branna and Ariel. And you've had installments 1 and 2, which were Rise of the Raven and the Countess of Darkness. And now I'm preparing the final book to continue the theme of those 3 stories on. The arc is actually really important to me because it's in the next book that this story arc will not only catch up with the end of the Heirs to the Kingdom series, it is also going to complete it, as the first lines of The Bowmen of Loxley finally do come full circle and reveal the full truth of a story which I actually began way back in the late 1980s. You know, this is a story that's dominated a very, very big part of my life. And I am a little bit excited to finally get onto what is going to be the final book of the arc, but it's also going to be the final book of the Heirs to the Kingdom series as well, as the 2 stories merge. In order to get the balance right for these stories, the story arc actually needed to be separated before it could be joined, which is why I've always stated that you really do have to read the first 8 books of the Heirs to the Kingdom series to really fully understand the true depth of this story arc. And both of the arc and Heirs to the Kingdom as a whole, Rise of the Raven and the Countess of Darkness, they can actually be read as a 2-book set by a person who's never read Heirs to the Kingdom. But you know, I've got to be honest here, if that is the case, the reader will actually miss out on some of my best interwoven writing. The Rise of the Raven is the story of Branna as she meets Ariel, and the powerful connection that they form. And in many ways, it's also the very start of what I consider to be the Heirs to the Kingdom story as an actual whole. Rise of the Raven ends in tragedy, and that is to a degree a necessary fate for Branna and Ariel, of which, you know, there's a very good reason why, one of which will become more and more apparent with the release of Violet Stone, the final book of the arc, later this year. As most readers know, Branna is actually Fae of Moon, and Ariel is Fae of Earth, so both have a long lifespan, which is why their story moves through the whole of the story arc, in the middle of which is actually Heirs to the Kingdom, the series. Rise of the Raven starts their story, which continues with Branna alone in the Countess of Darkness, because at that point Ariel rests locked away in her crystal box, and Branna takes Morgana under her wing to help her come to terms with all of her Fae powers. Now, as we see in Heirs to the Kingdom Book 8, Branna falls and Ariel is released from her slumber, which leaves her free to enter the final book of the story arc as she returns to the land of her people and prepares the way for the coming of Violet Stone, the next Queen of Fae. In the Countess of Darkness, it's during the rule of Rhiannon, and whilst Morgana is only very young, that Opal actually makes the prediction of the coming of the bowmen, which is also the start of the bowmen of Loxley, in the guise of a flashback. This should give you some idea of how long I've actually been working on this story, and some of the things I already knew as I began to write Heirs to the Kingdom. It really has taken me 30 years to finally bring the whole complete story up to date. The coming of the bowmen and the new days are actually meaningful, but I'm going to leave all that, for you to just figure out, because I've not released Violet Stone yet, but it is actually very, very important. The truth is, every character I've ever created within this massive piece of work is important to the whole in one sense or another. And at times, what appear to be small, meaningless moments do actually have a great relevance on what the story builds up to. Now, one such example would be in Book 1 of Heirs to the Kingdom, and the meeting of two characters called Bob and Stan at Honey Hill. Towards the end of the Bowmen of Loxley, Bob and Stan are actually brought before Robbie by Runestone, and as Robbie has to decide their fate, he kind of talks to them to get a measure of them. Now, we know that they're two soldiers of Mason Knox who were captured by Rowan and Jade, and they've been held prisoner in the camp to keep them out of circulation. Both of them were not very brave, but why are they important? And my reasoning behind that is very, very simple. The impact of Bob and Stan would stay with Robbie throughout the whole of the Kingdom series, which is set just over 1 year of the Loxley calendar. So when the end of the book series arrives, it's actually the influence of the two prisoners that plays a very vital role in the decisions that Robbie makes. At the camp, Robbie's very honest with them as he questions them. "Well, gents, you've been very well behaved, although I'm not foolish enough to think you would run. I know as well as you do that you'd not get a mile before you were dead." Both of them lowered their heads and agreed. "What should we do with you two, I wonder?" Stan lifted his head. He was in his early 50s and had lived a hard life that shone on his face. He had small tufts of hair at the sides, but the rest had fallen out. His face was dark from the sun and very lined. He also looked old and frail. "I beg your pardon, my lord. We was hoping we could stay here." Rune smiled. "Why would you want to remain here? Is your loyalty not to the army of Knox?" "We have no loyalty to him, my lady. We were dragged out of bed in the middle of the night and told to fight or die. They said if we ran away, they would kill our kids. Only we knew they would come. We told our families to head to my brothers in Norfolk if they did take us." Robbie watched as Stan spoke. Bob nodded in agreement with Stan. "So, your families are safe, and yet you did not run?" "No disrespect, my lord, but we're being fed regular, and we thought over here we'd be out of harm's way, and we'd not have to fight. Now I know that sounds wrong, but it was the best of a bad situation." They both hung their heads in shame. It was a pitiful sight to watch. It really is an important part of the book, because it really does go to the heart of the way in which Mason Knox recruits his men to fight the Woodland Realm, which is through fear and intimidation. And it's at this point that Robbie starts to really understand that as he speaks with them. "So, now we have you here and you're faced with being a prisoner with us or being killed for deserting your post by Knox. It does appear you're in quite a jam, gents." Both of them looked at Robbie with sad eyes. Bob summoned up the courage to talk. "I don't want to die. Who would look after my wife and kids, my lord?" Rune looked at them sadly. She felt very sorry for their terrible situation. "Well, what is it you want us to do with you both?" Bob seemed almost surprised at her question. "Oh, please, my lady, give us a chance. We can help out round here, and if you send us back, well, we're dead men. Don't you see that?" She smiled at him. "But how can we trust you? Technically, you're our enemy." Stan seemed to be very offended by the remark. "I'm no one's enemy, and I never have been in my life. Tie us up, keep us in a tent if you must. I may not be as high and mighty as you, but I'm still a man of my word." The honesty and the sincerity of Stan, it shines out of him. And it's clear to see that he did not want the war. He did not want to fight. All he wanted was the very same thing Robbie did, which was the freedom to have a piece of land, a safe home, and a way to protect and raise his family. It's a small dream, and yet even in today, in this modern world, it's actually a dream shared by many young couples who are just starting out. As some could say, for some, it's probably the most important aspect of their life. You know, when you think about it, Bob and Stan are the enemy of the Woodland Realm. I mean, Robbie could have flicked his wrists and they would have been killed by any one of the specialists from his party. And yet he did not. He does the same in Avalon in Book 6, when the members of the church are being slaughtered and hunted by the Hulan. He makes the decision to send aid to them, so that they can be brought to safety, having had their lives spared. And again, is a very, very important part of the story, because this goes to the very heart of the man that he is going to become much later on in the book Violet Stone. All throughout Heirs to the Kingdom, we see acts of great kindness that come from Robbie. And as a result, his men and the specialists follow his lead, and they support his decisions to respond in kind. The specialists do great acts of kindness, none more so than the work that they do to help a struggling nun save her mission in the House of Good Hope, or even on the motorway heading back north to Loxley, where Robbie actually sets up and then sits at a campfire with some of those weary people who've been expelled from their lands and fled in fear, as Mason retaliates against Robbie for preventing his crowning. These moments have a very profound effect on him, and they change the way he sees the war. The contrast of the two, compared to Mason, is greatly highlighted. Robbie acts to save his people, but Mason Knox, who cannot find a way to defeat the hooded man, attacks his people and he slaughters them in their beds, or hangs them from trees, for all to see the power of his mighty empire. The needless slaughter of people is a significant weakness of Robbie, and it is why he is fighting. And that is the reason Mason goes out of his way to send his most brutal cutters to torture and victimize the weak. He knows that it really, really hurts Robbie. It's no different really today, you know. I mean, if you look at modern warfare, we've seen the brutality of the Nazis, or how Mao used his soldiers to kill millions of his own people, and how millions died under the brutality of Stalin. And it's still happening today. We saw it in the war that broke up the former Yugoslavia. And it's actually happening currently in Africa and many other areas of the world, where people are needlessly slaughtered for the power and the will of one man's greed. When I first began writing Heirs to the Kingdom, I posed a question to myself: what is truly evil? And if I can understand that, then what would true goodness look like? In many ways, it was my search for that answer that became the driving force behind the series. And to my surprise, it evolved through the writing as I began to take apart aspects and acts of great hatred and revenge to seek out the core of such evil ways. And then when I realized what I thought was evil, I countered it with Robbie's reaction in the story. Now, as I sit here today to or as I sat here today to prepare for this episode, I think I finally, fully understood the journey that I began with the writing, because my viewpoint moved and adapted as I wrote more and more of the series. And by the time I was done with the 8th book, I was already working on the story arc as part of that, I began as early as the 5th book, especially in regard to characters like Morgana. I think the Countess of Darkness really does highlight some of where my mind has moved to, because I learned very quickly that evil has many faces, and it's hard to compare them all together. The way Mason slaughters his way up the north of the land, as he does up near places like Carlisle, or how he enslaves whole families, as he does with Megan and her family at Scarborough, are equally vile. Even Billy's betrayal cuts very deeply, and it scars Robbie, as does the death of Ruby. Robbie witnesses too much death throughout the whole of the series of Kingdom, and it does take its toll on him, which is shown in the very last book of the Kingdom series, The Circle of Darkness. Robbie gave a nod as he turned his head to see the endless fields of trampled mud and red blood-soaked water that had formed puddles between the dead and the dying. This is such a waste, Rowan. There really was little response as he too observed the hundreds of dead from both sides that littered the field. He gave a soft squeeze of Robbie's shoulder to reassure him. Robbie lifted his sleeve and wiped the side of his dirty face. Too many good men have been wounded or lost in this battle. Too many mothers have wept at the loss of their sons. Those left standing this day, they'll call themselves the victors. But no one has won here. For if the price to be paid is the spilled blood of good men, then there can be no victory for anybody. War's caused by those few who yearn for greed and power, and their blood is always too precious to spill on the grass, so that innocent men die in their place. Those that start wars always survive them with greater riches or power, and many families weep for the loss of their young. Tell me, Rowan, where is the honour or victory in that? In the last book of the Heirs to the Kingdom series, it is quite clear that Robbie is tired of all the death, and he would much rather end the war between him and Mason using dialogue. But Mason is drunk on power and will not stop until he has complete dominance, which to a degree does become his undoing. The last book does have a very, very anti-war theme, because that is my own stance, as also something that, it became very, very obvious to me during the writing of this whole series. At the very end of the series, Robbie turns his back on fighting, and to a degree there are some who at first do not really understand why. I mean, after all, he is the victor, and he hands the throne to the rightful heir. And for myself as the author, I've always thought that it's the mark of a decent man. That moment when you stop and you say, enough is enough, that is the mark of a real man of power. And yet, Robbie gives it all away to return back to his roots and the very same dream as Stan and Bob, which is why in book 1 they were important characters. I like to think that Stan and Bob were the start of Robbie's process of learning and growing up, and because of that they have a place in important characters in Heirs to the Kingdom's tale. In the final chapter, we see how Robbie reacts after the war has finally ended in the closing paragraphs. Little is known of the soldiers from Mason's army who lived. The site of the battle, and for several miles in every direction, was littered with discarded black vests and weapons. There were some who wanted them hunted down and imprisoned for their part in the Great War, but Robbie declined, stating his aim was always to create a country of free men. In his mind, the memory of their times as soldiers to the Black Army would last them a lifetime, and he hoped because of it they would live their lives in peace as much better men. On his return to Loxley, Robbie took off the Sword of Destiny and hung it on the wall behind his desk in the village hall. He handled it only one more time, and that was the day he brought it to his rebuilt house at Robbiesmere, where he placed it beside the scorched recovered white staff belonging to Ruby, next to his desk in his new lost office. He's never used the sword since, although to this day he remains a bowman of unnatural talent. I would say that the most important aspect of Violet Stone is that because of the influences and decisions that Robbie makes at the end of the Circle of Darkness with Runestone, he's able to raise his family in peace. And that is far more important to this story than readers will at first realise, because it's actually within the simplicity of Robbie and Runestone's parenting that the ability to unite all of the different lines of people and actually bring balance is finally achieved. And that will be the sole task, not of Robbie or Runestone, but actually of their firstborn child, their heir, Iona Violet. The simple truth is that how he raised his daughter and the things that Robbie taught her actually become the core of who she grows up to be, which in this case is very important, because Iona is going to be crowned the Queen of Fae of Earth. Through the man that her father is, which is very decent and respectful, Iona is guided and educated on a path of peace, truth and fairness, which is how Robbie and Runestone raise all of their children. It shows most in Iona, who has a very big heart and ability to show love, but also has the determination to fight for what she believes in, which is the truth. Her education from her parents and the examples that they set become how she will rule, and it really is vitally important to the plot of the last book, because Iona has to be the bringer of balance to all things, which again is why Opal's prediction is so important. Look to the bowman, for he will be the start of new days. As I came towards the end of writing the Circle of Darkness, because the Heirs to the Kingdom series changed a great deal as I wrote it, because to a degree, even though I had a lot of different ideas about this story and the many different directions that it could actually go in, the story to a degree over the writing had taken on sort of a natural evolution of its own. It became very apparent that in order to really wrap up this story, it could only end when the age ended. The Age of Dreams had to go. It had to be replaced, otherwise nothing would change. And there had to be a focus in a completely different direction. Heirs to the Kingdom was always the story of Robbie and Runestone, and it was the start of the Age of Dreams, because it was their life, their fight, and their dreams. And in a sense, that was the meaning behind Opal's prediction. Look to the coming of the bowman, for he will herald the start of new days. New days, in the meaning behind that. There are many layers to Kingdom, but ultimately it was always going to be a story about those who walked before us and about those who came after us. The whole 8-book series on those who came before us and the influences that they had, and that also applies to the first 2 books of the story arc of Branna and Ariel. Both books showed what had been, and as I approached the final book of the arc, which will be Violet Stone, it was as clear as day that the only way to bring all of the story to a climax and final resolution was to end the age created by Robbie and Runestone. The Age of Dreams had to come to an end. In a little bit of a slight twist. The Age of Dreams began actually with the birth of Iona Violet. And so it became more evident that the age would have to end the moment the crown of Fae was placed on her head. Iona's crowning signalled to Runestone her time would start to dwindle in the Woodland Realm, in the very same way it had to her grandmother Opal and her grandfather Hearn. That's not a clue, by the way, to how this story ends. This is me, after all. And as you all know by now, nothing's ever that simple with me, because there's still time for some epic adventure. Iona Violet is the focus of this book. To a degree, Robbie and Runestone, whilst important to the story, are not the central characters. The central characters of Violet Stone are more Iona and Ariel, because this book is more about Fae than it actually is the Woodland Realm. But readers are not going to be disappointed, because you will get to see how Loxley develops, and you will be introduced to the children of Robbie and Runestone, who've increased in number. And also, there is going to be an inclusion of Jet and Jade's children. The feel and the atmosphere of Violet Stone is very, very Heirs to the Kingdom. And the central theme, as always, is look to the past, because that has been the central theme of all of the books. So there's no doubt that, this book highlights why history and its accuracy is so important, and why the truth, more than anything else, actually matters. And it should never be diluted or hidden in any way. Ariel is a seer of the highest magnitude. She is the daughter of Anaria, the most powerful seer of the Fae to date. And as you know, the passage of power grows stronger in the females. So with the daughter of Anaria, and also the daughter of Runestone, I have two leading characters of immense power, even if one of them is actually still finding her feet. For those of you who've reread the books in order, which is Heirs to the Kingdom first, and then the two story arc stories, you will find that Violet Stone picks up all of those loose threads, and it runs with them into the final tying up of everything in what will lead all of the readers to a very big surprise. As much as they were reading, as much as they were actually when they were reading the Countess of Darkness, which I'm so thrilled to say through absolutely everybody, by providing a story that no one saw coming. And it's in that respect, Violet Stone is no different. It's important to really digest and understand Branna and Ariel's story, as well as Morgana's, because they're actually very, very relevant to this final book. And so is Heirs to the Kingdom, Book 8. This story has really been woven together over an incredibly long period of time. And it's amazing, actually, when you actually sit back and look, which I've done recently, at how many pads and notes and little kind of bits I had here, there and everywhere, all waiting to be stitched together. And it's only really when you start to understand the last chapter of Book 8, whilst appearing like the final instalment with Heirs to the Kingdom, was actually me setting things up for the final book of the story arc, which is going to be Violet Stone. And Violet Stone opens 6 weeks after the final battle, and then it jumps ahead in time 18 years. And it reveals how everything around Loxley has changed, including the Lord and Lady of the area, who are now parents to more than 2 children. Violet Stone is the moment, as I said earlier, where Heirs to the Kingdom collides head-on with the story arc. And as Violet Stone finishes the arc, it will slice into Heirs to the Kingdom and become the final ending of the whole collection of stories that are based around these characters. You could say It is the final tribute to years of work, or you could even say it will be the ultimate Heirs to the Kingdom story. Because this book will take Opal's words from her prediction and bring everything finally into the light. I do feel the Countess of Darkness is the best book that I've written to date, even though some actually will argue with me and have that it's Hans Cottage. I actually disagree with that because, I love the Countess of Darkness and I really put a great deal into how the book was built. But I'm not going to deny, I do feel once it's been published, Violet Stone will blow the Countess of Darkness completely out of the water. Violet Stone, to a degree, whilst being a very wonderful story, will also answer all of those questions that are still hanging in the air. Will Billy ever lose the marks of bark on his face? Will Raven Merle pick up where our grandmother left off? And what was the real significance of the White Raven to Morgana? I feel for myself, one important question has to be, what will happen to Ariel, who now has to live for the rest of her life alone? And will the White Lord finally reveal all of the meanings to his endless riddles? No author is ever completely happy with a finished book. And I would say that if I was to write Heirs to the Kingdom today, it would probably actually be written a little bit better. I find myself reading it back and thinking, I could have phrased that better, or maybe I should have done that aspect differently. But that is just me. Because if the truth be known, Heirs to the Kingdom does mark my struggles at times coming to terms with actually publishing this series, which I never actually really intended to do. I became, in a sense, an accidental author, although looking back at Heirs to the Kingdom and the Curio Chronicles and Hans Cottage, and even Branna and Ariel's story arc, I cannot deny writing has been the happiest time of my life to date, and I cannot believe I did not pick it up and get the courage sooner to do it a lot earlier in my life. I've never been completely happy with all of Heirs of the Kingdom. I could definitely write the first book much better today. But as I look back on what has been a huge chunk of my life, I know that with Violet Stone, I stepped up to the plate and given the whole series of stories the right and proper conclusion. And I really am happy with that, for I feel this series really, really deserves it. The baton has now been passed as another age of heirs dawns. And that's actually the perfect way to stop and move on to other projects, as Heirs of the Kingdom has finally, as tradition states, come around in a full white circle. I doubt that there'll be any more stories to write with the Heirs of the Kingdom characters. There may be the odd short tale, but I really don't have anything now that I could expend into a full-size novel, as my huge pile of notes, built up in the late 1980s, has finally reached a level that contains little more to share, and the file cabinet that once housed the huge piles of pads and drawings now lives in my shed and is filled with tools and bits of things to use in my garden. Kingdom is now a huge file on a hard drive, where it will remain forever, just lots of little short pieces, most of which have already been sewn into the fabric of this beautiful and epic fantasy adventure, which is now spanned over 11 books. And honestly, the way I feel at the moment, I feel that it's enough. Violet Stone is coming. I'm working on the last few small details of the edit, and then I will push it forward and it will go into production and out for print. And as I hand it to the world to do so as it chooses with, I'm hoping that it really is a tribute to what is, or what has been a wonderful journey, which has been supported over the years with great enthusiasm by a very dedicated few. And to those people, I really do want to raise my hat and salute and thank them from the bottom of my heart. You know, it's been a real privilege to write for all you people. So thank you for loving my characters and for reading my words, because it really made a difference, especially when I first started out and I was really struggling as a writer to get noticed. I mean, I still struggle now. I have nowhere near the reach I would like, because I would love more people to read this. But that dedicated few who supported me in those early days, it mattered far more than any of you will ever really realise. Violet Stone is going to be out within months, so be ready for it. And in the meantime, I'm already creating new characters and new stories to share as I move into writing pastures anew and a whole different kind of story to weave together and share with all of you as soon as I've got the manuscripts finished. Thank you very, very much for listening in today. If you're an Heirs to Kingdom fan, this is a really important episode to listen to, because if you've been following the story arc, you know, you can start getting excited. The book, the final book, which will be called Violet Stone, and will focus Iona Violet more than any other character, is moving towards production. I'm still just tweaking it, but it will be out very shortly, and it will complete 30 years of working on this one piece of story, and I really do hope you enjoy it. So I do appreciate everyone who listens in, and the podcast is only small, doesn't have a huge amount of subscribers, so if you're new to the site, please subscribe, like the video. It helps me push it forward and get the viral reach bigger. I'll be back next week with something completely different, no idea what at the moment, but until such time, have a wonderful week, and I will see you all then.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.